Sarah was nervous. It was her first flight in first class as the lead flight attendant. And this wasn't just any flight, it was the big one. She had heard whispers in the break room about the VIP passengers that would be on board. She had heard the rumors, but she didn't believe them, yet the responsibility weighed on her shoulders like a heavy coat. She straightened her uniform and took a deep breath. She wasn't about to let this opportunity slip through her fingers. As she walked down the aisle to begin her rounds, her eyes scanned the passengers, the usual mix of business people, wealthy travelers, and people just wanting to get to their destination. But then she noticed a woman sitting in the corner of first class, dressed in a large hoodie and oversized sunglasses. The woman looked ordinary at first glance, but something about her felt different. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, the way her presence seemed to make the air around her a little thicker, like she was someone who commanded attention without needing to raise her voice. Sarah made a mental note of the woman, but quickly moved on. She had a job to do. After all, the woman in the hoodie wasn't her priority, or so she thought. As Sarah continued her service, she couldn't shake the feeling that the woman in first class was watching her. Every time Sarah passed by the seat, she caught a glimpse of the woman's eyes peering over the sunglasses. There was something calculating about the way she watched her. It was unsettling, but Sarah dismissed it as paranoia. After all, it was just another flight, right? Soon Sarah arrived at the front of first class, ready to take the drink orders. She began with the passengers closest to the aisle. But then she reached the woman in the hoodie, who spoke in a soft voice. "I'll have a sparkling water with lemon, please." It was a simple request, but Sarah was irritated. She had just had a stressful interaction with another passenger, and she didn't have the patience for someone who seemed to be too good for a regular drink order. She shot back with a quick response. "We only have plain water or soda, ma'am, no sparkling water." Without thinking, she turned to move on, but the woman didn't budge. She didn't get upset. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she simply nodded. "Then I'll have a glass of the regular water, please, no ice." Her calmness only irritated Sarah more. Why was this woman acting so entitled? She thought she was just another celebrity wannabe, treating the flight attendants like they were at her beck and call. Sarah began to wonder if she should treat her the same way she treated the other demanding passengers, who always thought the world revolved around them. Sarah tried to hide her annoyance and moved on, but something still felt off. Later during the flight, Sarah had to pass by the woman again, who hadn't said a word since the drink order, but as she walked by, she saw the woman glance up and smile just slightly. It was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and Sarah's stomach churned. It was almost as if the woman knew something Sarah didn't, and that unsettling feeling grew stronger with every step she took down the aisle. The rest of the flight passed slowly. Sarah's mind kept returning to the mysterious woman in first class. Who was she? Why did she feel so uneasy every time she was near her? The passengers had settled into their seats, and the hum of the plane's engines filled the air. But to Sarah, it was a distant sound. The only thing she could hear now was the faint image of that woman's calm demeanor that seemed to hide something much darker behind it. And for the first time since she started her career, Sarah began to wonder if she had made a mistake judging this passenger too quickly. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every time she passed by the woman's seat, the air seemed to thicken, and the tension around her felt like a pressure she couldn't quite escape. It wasn't just the woman's quiet demeanor or her odd smile. It was the way Sarah felt, so exposed, like she was being watched even when she wasn't looking. Sarah tried to focus on the other passengers and their needs, but the more she tried to push the feeling away, the more it crept back into her mind. By mid-flight, Sarah had made her way to the galley to grab a quick drink. She needed a moment to collect herself and shake off the unease that had settled in her chest. She couldn't figure out why she felt so off. It wasn't like her to be distracted by one passenger, but something about this situation was different. Her mind kept returning to the woman in first class. Why did she feel so familiar, like Sarah should have recognized her from somewhere? Just then, one of her colleagues walked in from the cockpit. "Hey Sarah, did you notice who's sitting in first class?" they asked with a knowing grin. Sarah shook her head distractedly. "No, who?" she replied, not even looking up. But her colleague continued, "I'm pretty sure it's Rihanna. You know, the singer." Sarah froze. Her stomach dropped, and her heart skipped a beat. Rihanna, the famous pop star, the woman in the hoodie and sunglasses, was Rihanna. She had been sitting there all along, so calm, so unbothered, and Sarah had treated her like just another demanding passenger. A wave of realization crashed over her. She felt her face go hot with embarrassment. All of a sudden, the small mistakes, the cold responses, the rushed attitude toward the woman came rushing back like a flood. Sarah had been too quick to judge. She had assumed this passenger was just another entitled celebrity, but she was wrong. And now it was too late to undo it. Her colleague's words echoed in her mind. "It's definitely her." And Sarah felt the ground beneath her feet feel a little less steady. She wasn't sure if she should confront the situation or pretend like nothing had happened, but she knew deep down that she couldn't pretend she hadn't just made a massive mistake. The rest of the flight felt like a blur to Sarah. Her mind was racing with thoughts of how she had treated Rihanna. What had she said? What had she done? She replayed every moment in her head, and the guilt gnawed at her insides like a constant reminder of how unprofessional she had been. Sarah tried to maintain her composure and continue with her duties, but her nerves were shot every time she passed by the woman's seat. She felt her gaze following her, and Sarah couldn't help but feel small and insignificant in that moment. She looked up to see Rihanna's calm face again, this time with a slight tilt of her head, as if she was watching her carefully. Sarah tried to offer a polite smile, but it felt strained. It didn't feel genuine at all. She couldn't even bring herself to make eye contact properly. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she had to grip the tray in front of her just to steady herself. The worst part was that Rihanna hadn't said a word. She hadn't raised her voice or made a scene, but Sarah could feel the weight of her presence and the unspoken understanding between them that the flight attendant had made a grave error, and now there was nothing she could do to take it back. The damage was done, and Sarah could only hope that Rihanna would let the whole thing slide without bringing it up. She wasn't sure how much more she could take. And then it happened. Sarah overheard another conversation between the crew. Two other flight attendants were talking in the galley, and she caught snippets of their words. "Did you hear she's Rihanna?" one of them said. "No way," the other replied. "Yup, she's been so chill though, no drama." Sarah felt her stomach tighten as the realization hit her even harder. Rihanna was right there under her nose the whole time, and Sarah had no idea who she was dealing with. She had underestimated her in the worst possible way. But what could Sarah do now? All she could do was keep her head down and pray the flight would end soon. She wasn't sure if she could face the woman who was sitting there in first class, so cool and collected, while Sarah was spiraling inside, unsure if she would ever be able to look her in the eye again. Sarah's mind was racing, her heart pounding in her chest as she walked through the narrow aisles, trying to keep herself composed. But every step felt heavier than the last. She couldn't stop thinking about what she had overheard. Rihanna was sitting just a few feet away from her, and Sarah had treated her like just another ordinary passenger. She tried to remind herself that there was nothing she could do now to change it, but the feeling of regret clawed at her relentlessly. Every time she passed by Rihanna's seat, she could feel the weight of her gaze. Even though Rihanna didn't say a word, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the pop star was silently judging her. It was as if the woman had a radar for who was genuine and who wasn't, and in that moment, Sarah knew she had failed the test. Sarah's thoughts kept spiraling out of control as the flight continued. Rihanna had been so calm, so collected through it all, never once showing any signs of frustration or anger. But Sarah couldn't stop herself from worrying about the possible consequences. She had no idea what Rihanna was thinking, or if she would say anything to the crew after the flight was over. What if she reported Sarah's attitude or complained about her treatment? Sarah had heard horror stories from other flight attendants about passengers who had the power to ruin careers with a single word, and the thought of losing her job because of her mistake was terrifying. The rest of the passengers didn't help either. Sarah tried to focus on them, but her nerves were getting the best of her. There was the elderly man who wanted extra pillows, the businesswoman who kept asking for the Wi-Fi code, the child who spilled their drink on the floor. Every small request felt like a mountain she had to climb, while her mind was consumed with guilt over the one passenger she had treated so poorly, and she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone in the cabin was watching her. It wasn't until Sarah reached the back of the plane to check on the passengers that the weight of the situation really hit her. She needed to face the truth. She had let her assumptions about Rihanna cloud her judgment. She had been so quick to dismiss her, to treat her like she was just another diva, and now she was paying the price for it. She leaned against the galley wall and took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. But every time she closed her eyes, she could picture Rihanna's face, the calm composure, the way the star had smiled at her earlier, a smile that seemed to hold so much more than a simple gesture of politeness. It felt like a knowing smile, the kind that came from someone who had seen it all, someone who had been in Sarah's shoes before, someone who had probably encountered far worse treatment from people who thought they could get away with it. And then the unthinkable happened. Sarah walked back into first class and found herself face to face with Rihanna again. This time, it wasn't a passing glance, it wasn't a brief moment of interaction. It was a full-on exchange of gazes, and for a moment Sarah felt like the whole world had paused. She could feel her heart beating louder in her ears as she looked into Rihanna's eyes. They were steady, calm, but there was something else there too, something Sarah couldn't quite place. Was it pity? Was it understanding? Was it a silent acknowledgement of the mistake Sarah had made? Rihanna didn't speak, she didn't say a word, but her presence seemed to fill the entire cabin. It was as if she didn't need to speak to make Sarah feel the weight of what had just happened, and for a second Sarah was frozen. She wanted to apologize. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. She couldn't find her voice. The silence stretched on, and it felt like an eternity, but finally Rihanna broke the stillness with the softest of smiles. It was a small gesture, but it carried so much weight. It wasn't the kind of smile Sarah expected from someone she had wronged. It wasn't filled with anger or judgment. Instead, it was calm, almost forgiving. And for a moment, Sarah felt like the weight in her chest had been lifted just a little. But before she could react, Rihanna turned away and looked out the window as if nothing had happened, and in that instant Sarah knew that the pop star wasn't going to cause a scene. She wasn't going to make a fuss about the flight attendant who had treated her unfairly, but Sarah also knew that she had learned a valuable lesson, one that would stick with her for the rest of her career. The moments after Rihanna turned away felt like an eternity to Sarah. She stood there frozen, unable to move. Her legs felt like they had been cemented to the floor. The weight of the interaction was heavier than anything she had experienced before. She could still feel the presence of Rihanna's calm gaze, as though it had imprinted itself into her mind. Every word unspoken yet understood, every feeling left unexpressed, but painfully felt. Sarah could hear her heart pounding in her chest, her breath shallow and quick. She tried to regain some composure, but it was impossible. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. For a few minutes she just stood there staring at the floor, unable to look at anyone else, not daring to make eye contact with the other passengers. She had to regain control over herself. But how could she when the image of Rihanna's face was burned into her mind, and the heavy weight of regret pressed down on her shoulders like a boulder? As she continued her rounds, Sarah found herself unconsciously avoiding first class. She kept telling herself she was just doing her job, but the truth was she couldn't bear the thought of facing Rihanna again. The woman had shown her so much grace despite Sarah's careless attitude, and yet she felt like the worst person in the world. It wasn't just about the mistake anymore, it was about what it represented. Sarah had assumed so much about this woman without knowing anything. She had thought she knew what kind of person she was dealing with, but now she realized how wrong she was, and how much she had let her own judgments cloud her actions. She reached the back of the plane, and her colleague came over to check on her, noticing her distant expression. "Hey Sarah, you okay?" they asked with a concerned look. Sarah nodded quickly but didn't say anything. Her colleague didn't press, but she could feel their eyes on her, and it made her even more self-conscious, as if the whole world could see what she was feeling. The rest of the flight passed in a blur. Sarah was going through the motions of her job, but her mind was nowhere near the cabin. She felt disconnected from everything around her. She couldn't stop thinking about the way Rihanna had acted with such poise and dignity. Even when Sarah had been so rude, the woman hadn't raised her voice or made a scene. She had simply turned away. But Sarah could sense that there was something far deeper behind that silence, something she hadn't understood in the moment, but now she couldn't shake it. Finally, the plane began its descent, and Sarah's nerves hit a new level. She knew she had to face Rihanna one last time before they landed. There was no way to avoid it. She had to go through the motions of closing up first class and preparing for arrival, and that meant she would have to pass by the woman again. When she finally did, Sarah took a deep breath and walked down the aisle. She moved as quickly as she could without seeming too hurried, trying to avoid looking in Rihanna's direction. But she couldn't help it. She had to look. And when she did, she found Rihanna looking at her again. This time her expression was unreadable. Sarah's stomach dropped, and she felt like she was going to suffocate under the weight of that gaze. They locked eyes for a brief moment, and it felt like everything around them disappeared. The noise of the plane, the bustle of the other passengers, it all faded away in that instant. All Sarah could see was Rihanna's eyes piercing through her, and she could feel the tension building once again. It wasn't the anger or resentment that Sarah had expected from someone she had wronged. It was something much more powerful, something that Sarah couldn't quite place, but it unsettled her deeply. Rihanna's gaze lingered for a fraction of a second before she looked away, but in that brief moment, Sarah could see something else in Rihanna's eyes, something like understanding or perhaps forgiveness. But there was no certainty in it, just an endless sea of emotions that Sarah could never hope to fully comprehend. As the plane touched down and the passengers began to prepare for disembarkation, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over her. It was over. They had made it through the flight, and in a few minutes the cabin would empty, and she could leave without facing Rihanna again. But something in her gut told her that wasn't the end of it, not for her at least. As she watched the last passengers gather their things, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between her and Rihanna, something that couldn't be undone. No matter how hard she tried to move on, it wasn't just a mistake, it was a lesson, one that Sarah would never forget. As the last of the passengers disembarked, Sarah stood at the front of the plane. Her mind was racing, her body was exhausted, but her thoughts wouldn't stop swirling around the same thing, Rihanna. She had barely spoken to the woman, yet she felt like she knew everything about her. The calm smile, the quiet confidence, the way she had carried herself with such grace. Through it all, Sarah couldn't stop replaying that final glance, that silent interaction. It felt like a challenge, an unspoken message that Sarah had failed in some way, but didn't know how to make it right. The flight attendants had finished their duties and were starting to gather their things to leave, but Sarah found herself lingering by the galley, staring out the window, lost in thought. She hadn't meant to treat Rihanna poorly. She hadn't meant to come off as rude or dismissive, but she had, and now she had to live with that mistake. She didn't know what to do or how to apologize. She felt like she was trapped in a never-ending cycle of guilt and regret, and she didn't know if she'd ever get out of it. Just as she was about to leave, the cockpit door opened, and her colleague walked out with a smile. "Hey Sarah, are you ready to go?" they asked, but Sarah could barely meet their eyes. She just nodded and followed them down the aisle. The plane was almost empty, except for a few remaining staff and the last few passengers who were gathering their things. And then it happened. As Sarah was about to pass by first class, she stopped dead in her tracks. Rihanna was still there. She was sitting by the window, now her eyes closed, as if she were resting. But there was something about her that made Sarah hesitate. It was like the pop star was waiting for something. Sarah didn't know what, but she couldn't move. She couldn't bring herself to just walk past her like she had earlier. It felt wrong now. It felt like the moment that would define everything. Without thinking, Sarah stepped forward, her heart racing in her chest. She wasn't sure what she was going to say, or if anything she said would even matter, but she knew she had to do something. She couldn't just leave without trying to make things right. She stopped by the seat, and Rihanna opened her eyes slowly, looking up at Sarah with that same calm expression that had unsettled her all flight long. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with tension. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat, and for the first time all day she felt truly exposed, like all her mistakes were laid out in front of her for Rihanna to see. Finally, Sarah gathered the courage to speak. "I just wanted to apologize." Her voice sounded small in the quiet cabin, but she pressed on. "I didn't mean to treat you unfairly earlier. I was rude, and I should have been more considerate." She swallowed hard as she watched Rihanna's face for any sign of reaction, but the woman just sat there silently, her gaze steady and unreadable. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest. She felt like she was drowning in the silence. Rihanna didn't respond immediately, and the longer Sarah waited, the more she felt the weight of her own words pressing down on her. She had apologized, but now what if it wasn't enough? What if Rihanna didn't care at all? What if the damage had already been done? But then something unexpected happened. Rihanna smiled just a little. It wasn't a wide smile, but it was enough to send a ripple of relief through Sarah's chest. The tension that had been building all throughout the flight seemed to dissipate just slightly, and for the first time since they had crossed paths, Sarah felt like she could breathe again. "It's all right," Rihanna said softly, her voice calm and reassuring. "We all have bad days." The words felt like a weight lifting off Sarah's shoulders, but there was something else in her tone, something that made Sarah feel like the apology was accepted not out of obligation, but out of understanding, as if Rihanna had already seen through her nervousness and insecurity, and didn't hold it against her. Sarah stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say next, but before she could find the words, Rihanna looked out the window again, her attention shifting back to the view outside the plane. Sarah knew that this was the moment she would carry with her forever, this brief exchange that had meant so much, but also nothing at all in the grand scheme of things. It was just one of those fleeting moments that would fade into the past, yet it had changed Sarah forever. She walked away from first class, slowly, her mind racing, still unsure of what she had learned from the encounter. But one thing was clear: she would never look at another passenger the same way again. She would never make assumptions based on appearances, or let her frustration get the best of her again. There were lessons hidden in every interaction, and today she had learned one of the hardest lessons of all. As the plane finally touched down on the runway, and the engines roared to life, Sarah knew that the flight was over, but the memory of it would stay with her long after she had left the airport. And as for Rihanna, she knew that she would go on living her life, unaffected by the small mistake that had almost undone Sarah's career. But for Sarah, the journey had just begun, and she would carry the weight of that moment with her for a long time to come. As Sarah stepped off the plane, her mind was still buzzing with everything that had happened. Her body felt drained, but her thoughts were anything but calm. She couldn't shake the feeling that this experience had changed her in some way that she couldn't yet understand. She kept replaying the brief conversation with Rihanna in her head, but every time she tried to make sense of it, the words blurred together, like a dream fading the moment you wake up. She had expected to feel better after apologizing, but instead, she felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. It was as if the weight of the mistake hadn't fully lifted, and yet she knew there was nothing more she could do about it. The airport terminal was bustling with activity, and Sarah found herself moving through the crowd in a daze. She couldn't focus on anything around her. Her colleagues were chatting excitedly about the next leg of the flight, and the passengers were rushing to catch their connecting flights. But all she could think about was that smile from Rihanna, that small gesture that seemed to say everything without saying a word. Was it genuine, or was it just a polite response? She wondered over and over again. It felt like the kind of smile someone gives when they've seen enough of the world to understand that people make mistakes. But how much of it had been out of kindness, and how much of it had been because she didn't care enough to make a scene? Maybe Rihanna had already seen it all too many times and didn't want to add another drama to her life. But that didn't make Sarah feel any less guilty. As Sarah made her way through the security line, she noticed a few people looking at her oddly. Some of them seemed to recognize her as a flight attendant, while others just gave her curious glances. She couldn't tell if it was because they had noticed her earlier interactions with Rihanna, or if they were just people who had too much time on their hands. But it made her uneasy. She felt like she was being watched, like everyone knew she had made a mistake, and now she couldn't escape it. When she finally reached the employee lounge, she took a seat and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The tension in her chest had only increased after the flight was over. It was like she had been holding her breath the entire time, and now that the experience was behind her, she didn't know how to exhale. One of her colleagues came over to her and sat down with a smile. "Hey, you did great today," they said, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to return the smile. She just nodded and stared at the floor, unsure of how to respond. "I don't know what's wrong with me," She muttered under her breath, "I just can't stop thinking about it." Her colleague looked at her with concern, thinking about what they asked. "The whole thing with Rihanna," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what I was thinking. I was so rude, and now it feels like I've messed everything up." Her colleague shook their head. "Don't be so hard on yourself. They said you can't expect to be perfect all the time. Nobody is. And it sounds like Rihanna didn't take it personally. If she didn't make a fuss, then maybe you're overthinking it." But Sarah wasn't so sure. It didn't feel like something that could just be brushed off. Her mistake felt too big and too real to ignore. That night, as she lay in bed trying to sleep, she found herself still wide awake, her mind spinning with doubts and insecurities. She tried to tell herself that it didn't matter, that Rihanna hadn't been upset, but the truth was it mattered to her. Sarah wanted to be better. She wanted to be the kind of person who treated everyone with respect, no matter who they were, and this mistake felt like a failure of that desire. The next day, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the flight. She had gone over every moment, trying to figure out where she went wrong. What exactly had triggered her initial judgment of Rihanna? Why had she assumed that the woman was just another entitled celebrity when she had no idea who she really was? And that's when Sarah realized the biggest lesson of all. She hadn't just learned not to judge a book by its cover. She had learned that people are complex, and that we all carry burdens that others don't see. She had made a mistake by treating Rihanna as just another passenger. She had assumed that the woman's fame meant she was entitled or difficult, but in reality, Rihanna was just another human being navigating her own life and struggles, and Sarah had failed to see that. As the days passed, Sarah found herself reflecting on that flight and on the brief encounter with Rihanna. More and more it became clear to her that the biggest change wasn't in how she treated Rihanna, but in how she now saw the world around her. She had learned to slow down, to look beyond the surface, to see the humanity in every person she encountered. And while Sarah didn't know if she would ever get the chance to speak to Rihanna again, she knew that the lesson would stay with her forever. It wasn't just about apologizing. It was about truly understanding the value of empathy and respect. It was about realizing that everyone has their own story, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply listen. As the days passed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had shifted. It was subtle at first, like a small crack forming in a wall that she hadn't noticed before. But the more she thought about that day, the more she realized that she wasn't the same person she had been before the flight. She had always prided herself on being professional, but now she saw that being professional wasn't just about doing your job. It was about treating people with empathy and respect, no matter who they were or what they did for a living. Each day, as she interacted with passengers, she found herself thinking differently. She noticed the little things, the way someone hesitated when asking for help, the way a mother gently reassured her child, the way a businessman rushed through the aisle without acknowledging anyone else. It all told a story, and Sarah realized that every person who boarded that plane was carrying something with them, and she had to see beyond the surface to truly understand them. But the more she tried to apply this new way of thinking, the more she realized how hard it was to truly change. She couldn't just forget her previous judgments. They were still there, lurking in the back of her mind like old habits. She had to constantly remind herself to slow down and listen to people, to give them the benefit of the doubt, because it was easy to fall into the trap of assumptions. It was easy to look at someone and assume they were just another passenger, but Sarah knew now that everyone deserved more than that. One afternoon, as Sarah walked through the terminal, she passed by a familiar face. It was a woman she had served on a previous flight. She had been quiet and reserved, but something about her stood out. She had a kind smile and a gentle demeanor, and as Sarah passed by, she caught her eye. For a split second, the woman smiled at her, and Sarah returned it before continuing on her way. But it wasn't the smile that stuck with her. It was the way the woman had looked at her, as if she saw her for who she truly was, and not just as another flight attendant going about her duties. It made Sarah pause for a moment and reflect on how many times she had missed that kind of connection with passengers. It was moments like these that reminded Sarah of how important it was to really see people. How often had she rushed through her interactions with passengers? How often had she been too focused on her job to notice the stories unfolding in front of her? She realized that those small moments, those quiet exchanges, were what truly mattered. They were the moments that stayed with you long after the flight was over. A week after the incident with Rihanna, Sarah had another flight. She had hoped that time would make the memory fade. But as she boarded the plane, her nerves flared up again. She didn't know why, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. The lesson still felt so fresh and raw, as if the encounter was just waiting to teach her more. She was working the same route as before, and she couldn't help but wonder if she would run into Rihanna again. She tried to focus on her tasks, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the same place. What if she saw Rihanna again? How would she handle it? What would she say? Would she be able to face her without feeling the weight of her mistake? Or would the guilt still hang over her like a shadow, no matter what? As she entered first class, she found herself scanning the rows of seats for any sign of the woman, but there was no sign of her. She let out a breath she hadn't even realized she had been holding, and felt a strange sense of relief, mixed with disappointment. What was she expecting anyway? She hadn't expected some grand reconciliation or some dramatic moment, but still the absence of Rihanna felt like a moment of closure she hadn't known she needed. The flight went smoothly, and Sarah kept to her usual routine, but there were moments when she found herself thinking back to that conversation with Rihanna, when she had apologized, and the small but meaningful smile the pop star had given her. She wondered what it had really meant. She didn't know if Rihanna had forgiven her, or if she had simply chosen to move on from the incident. But either way, Sarah had learned something that no one else could have taught her. After the flight, Sarah found herself sitting in the lounge again, the same place where she had reflected so many times before. But today was different. She didn't feel like she was carrying the weight of a mistake anymore. She felt lighter, like a burden had been lifted, and for the first time in a long time she felt at peace with herself. She had learned to let go of the guilt, to accept that everyone made mistakes, and that the key was to learn from them, not to be consumed by them. And as she sat there reflecting on her journey, she realized that this wasn't just about one moment with one passenger. This was about how she was going to approach every day from now on. She was going to look at people differently. She was going to treat them with kindness and respect, no matter who they were, no matter what they did, because she had seen how one small mistake could change everything, and she didn't want to make that mistake again. In the end, Sarah knew that the real lesson wasn't just about apologizing to Rihanna. It was about understanding herself and the world around her. It was about growth and change, and the realization that everyone had their own story, and the only way to truly connect with them was to listen. Weeks passed since that fateful flight, and Sarah had settled into a new rhythm in her life. She couldn't say that everything had changed overnight, but she could feel the shift in herself, and the way she approached the world. Her colleagues had noticed it too. There was a softness in her voice, now a warmth in her smile, something that hadn't been there before. But it wasn't just about the small gestures. It was about how she viewed her job and the people she interacted with every day. She had become more patient, more understanding, and with each new passenger she served, Sarah made an effort to see beyond the surface, to learn their stories, even if it was just in passing. One afternoon, Sarah found herself walking through the airport after a long shift. Her feet were tired, and her body ached from the constant motion. But her mind was clear. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't replaying the events of the past over and over again in her head. She had let go of the guilt, the doubt, the fear of making another mistake. It was liberating to finally feel free of the weight she had carried for so long. As she walked through the terminal, her thoughts wandered back to Rihanna. She hadn't seen the pop star since that day, and part of her wondered if their paths would cross again. She couldn't deny that there was something unresolved about their encounter. It wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about the connection they had shared in that brief moment, and how it had impacted her in ways she couldn't fully explain. She wasn't sure if Rihanna had thought about her since then, but Sarah had carried the lessons from their interaction with her every day, and it had changed her for the better. As she approached the gate, Sarah noticed a crowd gathered around one of the waiting areas. It wasn't unusual. There were always people waiting for their flights. But today something felt different. She couldn't explain it, but she was drawn to the group. As she got closer, she saw that there was a familiar face in the crowd, a face she hadn't seen in weeks, but had never truly forgotten. It was Rihanna. Her heart skipped a beat. As she stood frozen for a moment, her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this, not like this. She had imagined running into Rihanna again, 100 different ways. But never like this, never in the middle of a crowded airport, with no time to prepare herself for what might happen. She wasn't even sure what to say, or if she should say anything at all. Rihanna hadn't noticed her yet. She was talking to a group of people, a few fans, and a couple of staff members who were helping her with her luggage. But Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from the scene. She had so many questions running through her mind. She wondered if Rihanna even remembered her, or if she had simply moved on with her life. But deep down, she knew that this wasn't about her. This wasn't about trying to make amends or finding closure. It was about what she had learned and how she had changed. As she watched Rihanna interact with the crowd, Sarah felt a sense of peace wash over her. The anxiety she had once felt about their encounter was gone now. It didn't matter whether or not they spoke. It didn't matter if Rihanna acknowledged her at all, because Sarah had already done the work she needed to do. She had already grown, and that was enough. After a few minutes, Rihanna began to walk toward the gate, and as she passed by Sarah, their eyes met for the briefest of moments. There was no dramatic recognition, no intense conversation, just a silent exchange between two people who had shared a moment of connection, a moment that had changed one of them forever. Rihanna's gaze lingered for a second, and then she gave Sarah a small nod. It wasn't much, but it was everything. It was enough to let Sarah know that she had been seen, that her apology had been heard, and that whatever had passed between them was now in the past. As Rihanna disappeared into the crowd, Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She had been holding her breath without even realizing it. And now that the moment had passed, she felt lighter than she ever had before. She took a deep breath and smiled to herself. She knew that she didn't need to seek validation from anyone else to know that she had done the right thing. She had learned the lesson she needed to learn, and now it was time to move forward. Sarah walked away from the crowd, her heart full of gratitude for the journey she had taken and for the person she had become. She knew that life would continue to throw challenges her way, but she was ready to face them with a new perspective and an open heart. She wasn't the same person who had boarded that flight weeks ago, and she was proud of who she had become. And as she left the airport that day with the sun setting in the distance, she couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle in her chest. Everything was exactly as it was meant to be, and she was finally at peace with herself.